Former U.S. Congresswoman Liz Cheney threw her full support behind Kamala Harris Thursday, campaigning in Ripon, Wisconsin, the symbolic birthplace of the Republican Party. Cheney is one of the highest-profile Republicans to cross over and support the Democratic nominee, arguing the U.S. Republic faces a threat unlike any it has faced before in Donald Trump.
I ask you to meet this moment. I ask you to stand in truth, to reject the depraved cruelty of Donald Trump. And I ask you instead to help us elect Kamala Harris for president.
Well, with more on Liz Cheney and the U.S. presidential campaign, we're now joined by Luiza Savage, executive editor for growth at Politico. Luiza, good to see you.
Great to be with you, Michael.
Listen, let's start here with Liz Cheney. A lot to talk about. But, you know, Liz Cheney, obviously a high-profile name. But given how almost equally divided Americans are politically, will her endorsement have any resonance with the Republicans, or is Cheney's brand of Republicanism dead?
Well, it's not quite dead, but there's no question that it has taken a very backseat to the MAGA movement in the contemporary Republican Party. But there's still a reason why this matters. And that is that in these important swing states, and Wisconsin is one, these very, very divided swing states, Kamala Harris really needs college-educated voters, suburban voters, and those include at least some disaffected Republicans. She's having some trouble right now with working-class voters. I think you may have seen in the news just recently that major labor unions have been declining to endorse her. For example, the firefighters union, they backed Joe Biden in 2020, and they just announced they're not making an endorsement, which is a bit of a slap in the face to Harris. The Teamsters said they will not make an endorsement. They're not going to support her. So in an election this close, she really has to gather whatever votes she possibly can. And they're taking the gamble that Liz Cheney could appeal to some of these Republicans, disaffected Republicans, women voters, independents who aren't comfortable with Trump, don't like his style, maybe don't like some of his policies, but otherwise might just stay home. So what better way to try to get them out for Harris than to take someone like Liz Cheney, and even her father, Dick Cheney, the former vice president, also endorsed Harris. So the hope is that they will at least get some of these Republicans to vote for Harris. And it's interesting, Michael, that Trump has been really trying to paint Kamala Harris as this very left-wing politician. He calls her Comrade Kamala. And I think what the Cheney endorsements do is perhaps give a little bit of cover to those Republicans who might say, well, how left-wing could she be if the Cheneys are endorsing her? So I think that's part of the calculus there, and a very interesting choice of words also by Liz Cheney, because she talked about patriotism, the importance of putting country over party, and endorsing and voting for a candidate who will observe the rule of law. And then as much as Kamala Harris has tried to avoid making her gender a big issue in this campaign, Liz Cheney did that for her. Liz Cheney did that for her. She said that a victory by Harris could also inspire little girls to do great things. So I thought that was also interesting.
So without a doubt, an influential voice. So when you talk about these swing states, when you look at the past election, decided by a few thousand votes here and there. So obviously very critical. But, you know, it's not as if the Harris campaign solves everything with Liz Cheney, because, you know, I'm thinking about her vice presidential running mate, Tim Walz, who really had a less than perfect debate night on Tuesday. And, you know, the most difficult thing for him seems to be answering questions about claims he makes, among them being in Hong Kong during the Tiananmen massacre. Let's play a bit of what we heard Tuesday night during the vice presidential debate, and we'll pick up the conversation.
All I said on this was I got there that summer and misspoke on this. So I will just, that's what I've said. So I was in Hong Kong and China during the democracy protests, went in. And from that, I learned a lot of what needed to be in governance.
So obviously not a flawless answer there from Tim Walz. He stumbled a bit, but apparently that one story is not the only embellishment that he's being called out for. What can you tell us about that?
Sure. So Walz, as much as he's supposed to be this regular guy, this wonderful former coach who was elected to office in a Republican district and then became governor. That was supposed to be this like warm and fuzzy persona that appealed to Harris when she picked her as him as her running mate. He has been accused of embellishing his background, of overstating certain things. For example, he talked about his military service and has said that he retired as command sergeant major. So veterans have pointed out, well, he didn't actually retire at that rank. He held that rank for a period of time. He'd also talked about guns and assault weapons as something that were weapons of war that he carried in war, but he never actually saw active duty. So these are sort of a pattern of embellishing and exaggerating details. And you might think, well, none of these individual details, is that important to the substance of the campaign. But when you start to add them up, they hurt his credibility and they hurt his image, which had been very positive going into this campaign.
Yeah, and I think that was the hard part. Going into the debate itself, he did really enjoy some fairly good public relations. That now seems to be stumbling in the last few weeks of this campaign. How problematic overall do you think it will be for the Harris campaign?
Well, I think at the end of the day, people vote for the top of the ticket, but it's been interesting watching these two vice presidential candidates, right? I mean, J.D. Vance was certainly a pretty unpopular in the early part of this campaign. He was getting a lot of attention for some kind of fringy comments that he'd made, talking about cat ladies, making comments about women that many interpreted to be misogynistic. But he had a pretty good night in the debate. He came off as much more reasonable than people thought he would. He was very soft, very polite. But at the end of the day, I think it was a draw for those two candidates. He also had a misstep. He was asked by Tim Walz whether he would admit that Donald Trump lost the last election, and he wouldn't comment. And so that exchange is now fodder for a lot of Democratic television ads. So I think they both had a couple issues in that debate.
Mm-hmm. So, that said, both having a couple of issues in that debate, big names like Liz Cheney coming in, trying to swing the pendulum. How are things looking right now? We keep hearing it's going to boil down to a few swing states at the end of the day. How are things looking in terms of one candidate perhaps leading over the other?
There is no clear leader. There just isn't. There are a few swing states where Kamala Harris is leading, Michigan being one. Pennsylvania being one where maybe she's leading. There are voices within the party kind of saying, well, privately our polling doesn't necessarily show that she's leading in Michigan. And it's hard to know what to make of those comments because sometimes people say that to their donors just to get them to pony up more money. Donald Trump appears to be leading in a couple of the more southern battleground states like Georgia. But there's no one candidate who right now has an advantage in getting to the 270 electoral votes that you need. And we have a story up today actually talking about Michigan, where Harris, at least in the polls, appears to be a little bit ahead of Trump. So the Republicans, the Trump campaign, are putting $1 million into television ads there, saying that Kamala Harris is trying to impose an EV mandate and that she wants to get rid of all non-electric cars, which, as you know, isn't exactly true. The Biden-Harris administration has been pursuing a policy to encourage electric vehicles. They've put in much more stringent requirements for vehicle tailpipe emissions, which would really require a lot of automakers to produce a lot more EVs within their fleets. They've also given big subsidies to encourage EV production in the United States. But the impression and the line that the Trump campaign is really using against them there to try to take that state away from her is that she's going to mandate and require electric vehicles. So there's still a lot of fighting that's going to happen in those key swing states where, some of these polls are within the margin of error.
Well, we continue to watch here. As you know, being Canadian, we take great interest in what's happening south of the border. Luiza, thank you for this. Really appreciate the time.
Great to be with you. Thanks so much.
That's Luiza Savage with Politico.